Welcome, everybody. I'm Richard Murray and I'm Chief Executive of the King's Fund. We're here today to discuss how to better support nurses and midwives' well-being and how we can transform their working environments to enable them to flourish. We'll be discussing some of the promising ways forward and some examples of good practice across the system, and I'm delighted to be joined by a very excellent team of people who'll be helping answer many of your questions. I should start by thanking our sponsor, the Royal College of Nursing Foundation, for supporting today and for supporting the report that the King's Fund wrote. We've also had the chance, because we were recording ahead of time, to get questions from you as you've come through the registration, and we will be trying to answer as many of those as we can as we go through. And do feel free to add questions on Slido. There's a box to the right-hand side of the video, and we'll then try and be able to respond to those questions in due course. We'll also be putting some polling questions and word clouds out to the audience that flash up during the session, and again in the same Slido box to the right-hand side of your screen. And do follow the conversation on Twitter. That's hashtag KFOnline as well. Well, let me ask our panel to introduce themselves. Can I turn first, please, to Laura?
Thanks, Richard. I'm Professor Laura Serrant. I am Professor of Community and Public Health Nursing and Head of Nursing at Manchester Metropolitan University.
Thank you, Laura. Jessica.
Thanks, Richard. Hi, everyone. My name's Jess Sainsbury. I'm a newly registered nurse working in two roles. So I'm in a developing education post and also community older persons mental health. Thank you.
Welcome, Jessica. Wendy.
Hello, I'm Wendy Layton. I'm a project manager working in the Regulated Professional Workforce National Team at Skills for Care. I am a registered nurse and health visitor, and I'm leading on workforce projects regarding nursing associates within the social care sector.
Thank you. Charlotte.
Hello, I'm Charlotte McCardle and I'm the Chief Nursing Officer at the Department of Health in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and I'm also a Royal College of Nursing Foundation trustee.
Michael.
Hello everyone, my name is Michael West. I'm Senior Visiting Fellow at the King's Fund and Professor of Organisational Psychology at Lancaster University.
Thank you, everybody. So before the pandemic, the nursing and midwifery profession was already one under very considerable pressure. There's a high turnover, many people looking to leave the profession, high rates of illness as well, and 40,000 vacancies. If you just look at the NHS in England, about 12% of the workforce, and similar numbers in social care. And then, of course, the pandemic has arrived on top of that. It's made issues even more difficult about attrition in the student nursing workforce and those that join, with around a quarter leaving in the first few years after they begin employment in the NHS. Now, there is work underway to try and improve this situation. Examples across the country of people trying to make progress on improving well-being in the working lives of nurses, and we'll begin to turn to some of those in due course. But first of all, if I can turn to Michael to share an overview of the recent report, The Courage of Compassion. Michael.
Thank you, Richard. And as you said, back in January, the nursing and midwifery workforce was probably facing the biggest crisis that it has ever faced since the NHS was established in 1948, indeed the welfare state. Stress levels, we think from all the data, were at the highest levels they've ever been. We know that in general, around 50% more staff in the NHS report debilitating levels of work stress compared with the general working population as a whole. And in the NHS staff survey in 2019, 41% of staff reported that they'd been unwell as a result of work stress during the previous year. Amongst nurses, that was 44%. Amongst community nurses, it was around 49%. And among midwives, around 51%. And when we look in the social care sector, we see similarly high levels of stress. and amongst general practice nurses too. And chronic stress, which is what we know is generally characteristic of those who are stressed in healthcare, has significant debilitating effects upon health in terms of cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular disorders, addictions, diabetes, cancer, and of course, psychological disorders like depression. That inevitably is also, as Richard, you've said, has had an impact on vacancy rates, with over 100,000 vacancies across the NHS in England, with over 40,000 nurse vacancies, and very high levels of intention to quit. We also see in the social care sector a turnover rate of around 31% a year. In other words, nearly 1 in 3 staff in social care are leaving their jobs every year, which places huge strain upon the system and upon their colleagues. And then, as you said, the pandemic struck with the increase in workload and the huge increase in anxiety and difficulties. So I think what our report, I think, has shown is we need to have a long-term strategy. This is not just about dealing with the huge challenges that the pandemic has thrown up, but also recognizing that we can't revert to where we were after this epidemic begins to fade. We have to think about a transformation of working life for the future. As you said, Richard, 1 in 4 nurses and health visitors leave within 3 years of joining the NHS. And that tells us something very important about the working conditions people are facing. So what are we to do? Well, our report, based on interviews, stakeholder meetings, focus groups, research across the system, across the 4 UK countries, told us about the importance of creating compassionate cultures where our focus on delivering high quality, continually improving and compassionate care for patients, service users, care home residents is enabled by a commitment to high quality, continually improving and compassionate support for all of our nursing and midwifery staff. And I think that we often see a sort of fallback position that what we need to do is to provide health and well-being programs that focus on things like yoga or mindfulness practices or resilience training. And all of those are, of course, important and they can be very beneficial, but they don't address the underlying workplace factors that are causing the difficulties in the first place. And what we know from decades of international research is people have 3 core needs at work. And when those needs are satisfied, people are well, they're healthier, they flourish, they're able to cope with challenges. And all 3 must be satisfied for people to be well and to have high levels of intrinsic motivation. And those 3 needs, that are the needs we all have at work, are the needs for a sense of autonomy or control, that we have influence, that we have volition, freedom, in terms of how we do our jobs most effectively. We have a sense of belonging where we feel we're cared for by our team colleagues, by our organizations, and where we care for those around us, where we have a sense of contribution or competence, where we can feel we're making a difference through the work we do to promoting the care and health and well-being of the people in the communities that we serve. And we identified 8 key areas that we must focus on to transform the workplaces and the working lives of nurses and midwives across the 4 UK countries and across primary care, secondary care, the social care sector. And those are the importance of giving nurses and midwives influence and voice so that they feel that they can shape their workplaces and improve the quality of the work that they do and the care that's provided. It's about ensuring that they're working in contexts that feel just and fair rather than characterized by fear and blame. And that includes a strong focus on discrimination, inclusion, and positively valuing diversity and promoting equity. It's about ensuring that working conditions are supported, that people can access nutritious food, they can take rests when they need it, they can get the drinks they need, they have some influence over rosters and work schedules so that they can effectively balance their work lives and home lives. And all those three elements give people a sense of control and autonomy. And second is the importance of belonging, and that's about working in teams, and ideally, although we often work in multiple teams, people having a stable home team that they come back to do their learning, to do their growth and development, to do their quality improvement, where they feel support, and working in cultures that are supportive and compassionate, characterized by compassionate leadership. And the third area, the importance of a sense of contribution or competence, is deeply undermined by people having chronic excessive workloads, which I think is rather like the pattern on the wallpaper in our health and care services that we no longer see. But it's the number one predictor of staff stress, the number one predictor of staff intention to quit, and the number one negative predictor of patient satisfaction. So we have to address chronic excessive workload as being a key factor that undermines the need for a sense of contribution and competence, and undermines well-being of our staff. And it's also about ensuring that staff have good managerial one-to-one supervision and supportive supervision, and opportunities for continuing growth and development, and developing skills so we feel a greater sense of competence. And what was really encouraging from the work that we did for this report, which was a huge privilege to be involved in, was that we found really outstanding examples, multiple examples of each of these recommendations across our health and care systems that I think give us hope for how we can spread the practices and adapt them for local contexts to ensure that we're meeting the underlying needs of nurses and midwives across all of the sectors and all of the UK countries. As I said, I think what's important is that we see this not as a short-term fix for short-term problems, but as the way forward for the future to transform the working lives of nurses and midwives so they can deliver the high-quality, compassionate care for communities that they and we and the communities all want for them. Thank you.
Michael, thank you. And what I'll do now is come to the other members of our panel and just ask them for their reflections on both the report and the things that you've said. So could I turn first, please, to Charlotte?
I think the report really has articulated very clearly many of the issues that we've known for some time in the profession of nursing and midwifery. And I think we're dealing with issues that have been building probably for the last 10 years since the recession kicked in, where investment in the workforce was not made in the way in which it would have alleviated some of the stresses and pressures that we're feeling now. So a lot of what the report is highlighting is the pressures on the workforce. And I think they are issues that are being addressed, but there is no immediate fix, and that will take time to put those things right. I do think there are other concerns in relation to the report. I think that the report certainly acknowledges that being a care professional of any profession is very demanding, and all of our nurses and midwives, and as we're speaking about today, give of themselves, both professionally but also personally, and sometimes at a cost to them and their families. And I think recognition that that is the case in the health and social care system would be a welcome start in starting to put right some of the concerns. I think there across the 4 countries, there are probably degrees of difference to the extent of which the report recommendations, not that they apply, but the severity. For example, 1 in 4 nurses leaving the profession would not be a feature that I would be familiar with in my country. But overall, yes, I do agree there is a high level of I suppose, turnover, either at undergraduate or early graduate. And I think it would be worth examining why that is and really drilling down into that. So on the whole, the report for me is very welcome. I think we have to acknowledge the real concerns and the real issues that are faced by the professions. And we now need to turn to what additional mechanisms we can take to rectify those issues.
Charlotte, thank you. Can I come to Jessica, please?
Thanks, Richard. So, before I start, a bit of a disclaimer from me in that up until 2 months ago, I was very much flying the student flag in absolutely everything I do. So, I think a lot of the things I say will be in relation to students, but I'll try and give the newly registered edge as well. Um, so, I spent a lot of time, listening to students, listening across 4 nations in the involvement I've had with the Royal College of Nursing Students Committee. And that hasn't changed. But when the report came out initially, I immediately gravitated towards the belonging theme. So I did an internship when I was at university, and helping nursing students and any students for that matter to feel like they belong to something bigger and really empowers them to thrive. And I tend to take it back to, Maslow's hierarchy of needs and having that sense of belonging and it being really, really vital. But then the more you read the report, that autonomy and contribution is just as important. So, for example, when considering working schedules, there's a huge call at the moment for nursing students to be able to self-roster. There's a student nurse based in Scotland who is doing some excellent work um, to champion this, because it allows students to have that element of balance in their lives when they're trying to juggle paid employment in order to be able to afford to live. Across the 4 nations, there's no consistent funding model for nurse education. They've got family commitments, they've got extracurricular activities or passion projects that they want to do on top of the normal being a nursing student. There are, when it comes to contribution, there's varied experiences when it comes to the availability and quality of clinical supervision, both for students and registrants. And some fields of nursing might have this embedded in practice while others don't. And a goal of a group that I'm part of is that clinical supervision is going to be an expectation for all new nurses coming into the workforce. I could go on, but those are my initial thoughts. Thank you.
Jessica, and we'll be able to pick up some of these points in greater details as we go through. Thank you. Can I come to Wendy, please?
Hi, yes. I think I would say that I think the report is very timely and very relevant, and it has to be seen in terms of the current situation with COVID. But actually, when we start thinking about it from a social care perspective, there is something about looking at where social care sits within this landscape and where the voice of social care is, including social care nursing. So the voice of nursing isn't that strong within that sector, or isn't always heard. And I think there needs to be perhaps a wider recognition of the role of the registered nurse within social care across a whole range of things. This isn't just about nursing homes. This is about a whole range of fields and nurses with a vast range of expertise. We have infrastructure problems in terms of social care and certainly in terms of social care nursing. So that's an added factor for those nurses. It's piling on. Michael talked about the turnover rate within social care. For nursing home nurses, the turnover rate is 41.5%. 41.5% of nurses are churned in the system. So there is something about, is that about their feeling of belonging? They do have responsibility. They do sometimes have autonomy, but it's not necessarily in a supported way or in a really supportive environment. I think the other thing to think about in terms of that is the recruitment to those posts comes from within that sector. There's not necessarily a good link for student nurses to think about working within social care, and maybe we need to be thinking about how we're supporting nurses to make those sorts of choices about careers as well.
Wendy, thank you. And Laura, please.
Hi, yes, thank you. I think I just wanted to pick up a link onto a couple of things that my colleagues have said, really. I think, as Michael said, that and Charlotte did, that one of the key things for me from the report is the fact that it really just shines a light on situations that existed before. and that this is not something that suddenly happened even in the last 9 months of COVID or in the last year or so, that it actually, what we have is a reflection of a lack of investment in over a long period of time. Also, I think sometimes a focus on a deficit model around nursing, so that, for example, that some of the actions that are proposed to support nurses and midwives within, retaining in the profession are, as Michael said, around kind of helping them to be stronger, rather than necessarily also looking at the systematic, the process and the systems-based issues, which make it difficult to both train, retain and actually continue within the profession. And as Wendy was saying as well, I think it's important that we identify diversity on many platforms within this report, and also diversity in the different ways in which experiences impact on nurses and midwives. So on one platform, the diversity around, as we've seen in COVID, the differential impact on different groups of nurses, on Black and minority ethnic nurses and groups in some sense, in one way, but also the diversity of how it's differentially impacted on nurses in different areas. So the impact felt by nurses within social work, social care arenas, those not within the NHS, because again, sometimes a lot of the publicity focuses on, secondary care, hospital based and NHS based. And, this report and what we're looking at is the diversity in the whole of the profession. So in different countries, in different areas. And so we need to kind of think about the impact on the profession as a whole, and not continuously, perpetuate one view of one type of nurse working in one place.
Laura, thank you. Michael, one of the things, and I described it as the wallpaper, is the problem over workload pressures. Did you get evidence, examples of ways in which people were trying to manage workload pressures, or of other ways of trying to bring down the balance between the ask on the staff and the need to care for patients?
So yes, I would say yes, but with a caveat, Richard, that actually what we saw is that in some sense people have habituated and said, well, this is just the nature of the work, that we have too much work to do and that's how it is, and it's it's just very highly demanding. Well, actually what we see is that it's having a very detrimental impact, not only on the health and well-being of nurses and their retention, but also on safety of care. So we saw places that, well, let me preface by saying the key issue, of course, is we have to have enough staff, and there is a workforce crisis, and we've got lots of thinking across the 4 countries about workforces of the future. I think in some of the UK countries that's better developed, but unless we have workforce strategies for nursing and midwifery, and indeed the whole of health and social care in the future, then in a sense, whatever changes we make to the work context, it's a bit like having a shiny car with no new car with no engine. So we saw places like East London Foundation Trust, which regularly asks its staff what would they reduce or get rid of, and lets them vote on the nominations and then implement change. They've reduced clinical audit activities by 85%. They're rated outstanding by the Care Quality Commission in England, and they do that in a context of a culture of quality improvement. We've seen during the pandemic lots of examples of the use of technologies to reduce workload in various ways, and those must continue to be explored in the future. We've also seen the importance of multidisciplinary team working during the pandemic, and before and after. We will see it, I think, as a really important emphasis, because the evidence we have is that working in, as I said, relatively stable home teams, ideally multidisciplinary teams, is a powerful way of enabling people to come together and look at the challenges they face and the demands they face and adapting accordingly. And that has an impact on staff health and well-being, as well as on innovation in quality of care. I think for the long-term future, it's also about the importance of recognizing that we need to integrate across the various sectors of health and social care in order to deal with the demands we face, and also to ensure that we're moving to a future where community engagement in health and social care is enabled, so that the community has genuine opportunities for co-design and co-ownership of health and care services. So we saw some outstanding examples, but I think it's incumbent on every leader in the NHS to be addressing the issue of chronic excessive workload with their teams, so that we find innovative ways of responding to this crisis.
Michael, thank you. You spoke there about the role of leaders in the system and what they can do to try and focus on workload, and of course other issues too. I'd like to come to Charlotte about the kind of leadership and culture that we should be trying to cultivate across health and care. How you approach the support that we can be given to those nursing and midwifery leaders.
I think the first thing to say is it should be an inclusive style of leadership. Nurses and midwives need to be involved in decisions at every level in health and social care, at policy level and at practice level, and into other settings, education setting, the independent sector. But without having the voice of nurses and midwives at the table, how do you get the power to act or the freedom to be and develop the best person, the best profession that you can be? So I think it needs to be inclusive, and I think we need to recognise nursing and midwifery as equal professions amongst a range of other multidisciplinary professions, and recognise that leadership roles are not just for people in senior positions. It's leadership roles for everybody across health and social care, right up and down and across various organisations, and nursing and midwifery, not just because of the size of those professions, but because of the breadth and the depth, and the fact that nurses are probably the only professional group that really reaches out to the four corners of health and social care right across the 4 countries. And actually in a lot of situations, they're best placed, I would argue, to lead a lot of the transformation that we need in our health and social care system. But in order for that to happen, they need to have a seat at the table. And I think that all of us need to recognise that investing in nursing and midwifery is investing in the economy. And the reason I say that is because it's well recognised around the world that nursing is predominantly a female profession, and so when you invest in females, that you're investing in everybody's lot. You're increasing the life opportunities for their families and for them, and so the next generation have an improved set of health and well-being outcomes, which is better for our economy. So on many levels, nursing and midwifery leadership is key to unlocking the answer to the challenges in the report.
Charlotte, thank you. I'd like to come to Laura about how do you think do we create these cultures of fairness, learning and inclusion? There's clearly a role for leaders, but there's clearly a role for all staff. I'd be interested to hear your views about how we try and support those more inclusive cultures.
I think, as I say, linking on to what Charlotte was saying, I think that, inclusion is the only way that we can actually achieve this. And that comes in many ways. I think that's often what tries to happen is that we try and do inclusion only at one level of a system or a process. So we try to include people at small levels, in small decisions, if you like, at the practical end of what's going on. But really, if we really want to include a culture of inclusion, we have to have that inclusiveness, as Charlotte says, right from policy all the way through. If we're in a situation where we, if you like, find the answer without including nurses and midwives, and then just bring them in to enact it, that's not really inclusion in that sense. And also, as I said previously, we need to think about what is it that we're trying to achieve here, and who is this for? And if it's actually to improve the whole profession and a range of ways in which healthcare is delivered, both within, as I say, secondary, primary care, and in different organisations, then we need to think what's the mixture of people we need at the table in order to take part in those decisions. Because only the people actually working in social care, working in primary care, working in community, working in systems that are such as in Northern Ireland, where it's a combination of health and social care, they really can actually give us that insight into what's required. I think we have to actually start seeing nurses and midwives working within their systems as a really positive resource to the decision making, not just a resource in delivering what has already been decided. And then we also need to think about, how much we include a diversity of perspectives within that as well. But it is a systematic thing to me. It's not an issue about individuals being, if you like, convinced as to the moral argument. To some extent, the moral argument around inclusion is one, or at least is accepted by the majority. But the systematic and process-driven application of that is where we actually need to make the next step.
Laura, thank you. And that kind of broader system view and the recognition about the fact that nurses work across the system in its every way. Of course, Wendy, for social care, I think it is tricky sometimes, I think, for some of us around the table, that we tend to have, even if unconsciously, the mental mind map of NHS hospitals sits in the back of our head. And of course, whether it's primary care or social care, it doesn't necessarily work in that way. Are there things you think that can be done to support nursing and midwifery leaders, particularly in the social care setting?
Absolutely, and I think it links back to some of the comments already been made. And when we're talking about integration of services, that's actually having social care at the start of that integration journey. That's not as an add-on. And I think so. I think there is an issue around social care itself, let alone social care nursing. I do think there is something that we need to address in terms of parity of esteem for social care nurses. So social care nurses are seen as who they are and what they are, which is a registrant, in the same way as a registrant in an NHS trust. They may do a different job, they may have a different way of approaching things. And I think that parity of esteem is within our own profession as well as external. I think that needs to be addressed. And it also has to come with recognition in terms of things like funding for CPD, for example. That doesn't come directly to a social care nurse, whereas it does because it's an NHS nurse. And I think a lot of the discussions that we have focus very much, the NHS is such a big animal and nurses are known within that, but nurses are doing a very vital job external to the NHS, working in partnership. And the idea of the sort of collective leadership that's been talked about, that has to be across systems, not just within an organisation. So social care needs to be represented fully in that as well. And I think nurses should should then be leaders in terms of that and be listened to.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to some of the questions, particularly some of the very popular questions that we were submitted through Slido. And Jessica, if I could turn to you first of all, we've heard about the attrition rate, both of student nurses, but also those once they're newly qualified. And it's difficult to increase the numbers in the profession if so many are leaving it, particularly so soon after they've joined. I wonder, what do you think could be done to try and ensure that both student and newly qualified nurses get the support they need, and what kind of support is it you think that they should be given?
Thanks, Richard. If I'm honest, I think we need to start, stripping it back to the basics and making sure we're getting those right. So, for example, for newly registered nurses, when they arrive, when they start, have they had a proper and full induction, not only in their local area but across the trust? What is the preceptorship program like? A lot of my peers have chosen their first roles because, as we've said, we are in a workforce crisis. There are a lot of posts available, so we have a bit of choice at the moment, which on one hand is great, because you might get an area that you're really, really interested in, but on the other hand, that they're choosing it based on things like, is the preceptorship program really good? What am I going to get out of it? What opportunities are there for me? What support is there? Because you hear so many horror stories from people's first weeks, months in post, which completely put them off, and then they decide that nursing isn't for them because of the bad experiences they're having, and we need to kind of stop that from happening. But there are pockets of really good programs and support available for new registrants in particular. So for example, I think in London there's the Capital Nurse program, there's Glow Stars as well, but if you look at them, it's about the quality of that program, but also the peer-to-peer support that they have as well, because I think, you know, that's something that's quite easy to set up but isn't always there, because if you're not, as the new kid on the block, introduced to other new kids on the block, the size of the trusts, it may be impossible to find that. So you need that facilitation from the trust in the first place and set these people up to, you know, help them thrive. But in addition to that, and this is applicable to nursing students as well, you need to surround them with people who have, you know, retained the passion for nursing, people who are excited, people who are passionate. And, you know, we all do have bad days. There's no denying that. But if you surround your students and your new registrants with people who are excited, who encourage them to be innovative, who, you know, really value their voice, then I think that really helps with, you know, the environment that these students and new registrants are going into. And you know, when I say it out loud, it feels really simple, but it isn't happening across the board. And then people compare it to others via social media, or, you know, other ways that they've networked, and they think they're getting a really rubbish deal. So it's just about that, having a good start, essentially, for me.
Jessica, as you said, some of the things you've spoken about shouldn't be too difficult to do, but clearly we do find them difficult to do. I'd be interested, Charlotte, how you've approached this issue of the support that can be given in Northern Ireland.
So they do seem like simple things, but nothing in healthcare is simple, and everything has a knock-on effect in one shape or another. And I think that the first thing we should do is to value the students and the new nurses as a precious commodity that we've invested, as well. We have invested a significant amount of money in Northern Ireland. The undergraduate programme is funded, and there is a bursary attached to it as well. And we still see a very high level of interest in nursing places, up to 8 to 1 for every place that's available in Northern Ireland. And we don't have the attrition rate that Michael was talking about earlier in the undergraduate programme. So there is something a little bit different there. And whether that's about the systems that are used for recruitment of students in the first place around value-based recruitment or not, I'm not sure. But it would certainly be worth exploring. But I think we do need to value them, and we need to create environments and cultures that are about learning. And for me, that's about an open and honest culture where it's okay to make a mistake if you own up to the mistake and you learn from that mistake, and it isn't one of blame. I think that culture, I mean, there was work done in the 80s, a number of evidence papers written in the 80s about the role, the culture being emanated from the ward sister, and were in a hospital ward where the ward sister showed concern and interest in the students, that then was the culture that predominated that ward area. And of course, the students and the new nurses, when they come to work, want to feel part of that culture, whatever the culture is in that team, and they want to be part of that team, and they will do whatever it takes to be part of that team. And so it's important that opportunity is there to show them and support them in the right way of doing things. I think other things like postgraduate education are important, and I have in my office a budget for post-registration nursing across Northern Ireland, and that's done on a yearly basis with our organisations about linking the requirements of the profession to the requirements of the system in terms of strategic transformation. And the other thing I would say is that the importance of coaching or supervision cannot be underestimated. It is really important that nurses and midwives have the opportunity to share their experience and talk about good things and bad things. And I have in Northern Ireland, just as a small example, a policy that every nurse and midwife has 2 sessions of professional supervision a year alongside their appraisal. So they're small example of things, but I think sometimes the small things are what actually make the difference to nurses and midwives when they're having a really difficult time at work.
Charlotte, thank you. And that picks up the question of this kind of support and the supervision that can help nurses and midwives throughout their career. I'd like to hear, Laura, your thoughts on that too, about how we try and build in that support, build in that supervision throughout the nursing career, not just at the start.
I think, thank you, Richard. I think that ongoing supervision and ongoing opportunity for personal and professional development is really, really key here. And I think also what we need to do is to start to think about it as something to sustain and to continue people's affinity and association with the profession, not just as a career enhancement. And I think that's probably where what's caused us some problems. I think our view of support and development has kind of become restricted to either resilience or to following a career line which is unidimensional. So for example, within nursing midwifery, if you want to do go along a career path, often you can get help and support to say, well, what do I need to do next to go to the next level? But what's often missing is, what do I need to do to increase the breadth of my experience beyond my initial training? So you go through the training and you get the opportunity to spend time on a range of different clinical and health and social care settings. But once you've kind of got the job, if you like, you're almost like very difficultly pigeonholed into becoming a specialist in that one area. And as we move through the profession and through our lives, as we've heard before, things change in terms of the other things we may become interested in, the other pressures that we might have in other parts of our lives. And it's much more difficult to move sideways, to actually stay within a particular trust or a particular area and move to another speciality, or to experience work in a different shift system or a different pattern, or just to help develop our breadth of our knowledge around that. So I think that supervision is and support is both individual in the way that Charlotte and Jessica have identified for the individual nurse or midwife, but it's also a group or a professional support to allow us to kind of diversify our interests. I mean, I know certainly now I qualified in 1986, and the kind of nursing I was interested in then is not the same as what I'm interested in now from my first job. But the options were to actually leave and move somewhere else for that opportunity, rather than being able to diversify where we are. So I think we need to look at it on two levels, as I say, the individual, as we've heard already, but also in terms of the system, and how do we as a professional system enable that diversification and enable people to move within where they are, and not necessarily just about getting to the next grade or getting the next career progression.
I just wanted to add to that, Laura. I completely agree with you, but also the starting points as well. I think we need to get better at showing our students that you don't have to start in a certain place and earn your stripes before you can go somewhere else. Like we should really be encouraging our students to, get a role in social care, or, if they want to pursue education, why not alongside something else? If they really want to go into research, why can't they do that? And I think at the moment, and I hear this narrative quite a lot from students, from the clinical opportunities available to them when they register, is you shouldn't go to the community because you need to work on the ward for X amount of years before you can possibly go into a community setting. So yeah, I definitely think we could be better at that as a profession.
Laura.
Yeah, if I might, I absolutely agree with you, Jessica. I mean, one of the things that I strive to do in my role, and I suppose this comes back to leadership in my role in leading a department of nursing, is actually to give the students the opportunity to see the range of options that there are available to them post qualification, and not necessarily straight away, but also at different points in their career, because I think it's sometimes a challenge from within our profession that we do have this shortfall, and particularly when the bulk of the shortfall, certainly in England, is within the NHS system. It's quite easy for students to feel that they're getting sucked into a large machine. And I think that, it's our duty to make sure that, the shortfall's everywhere. But also we do need people who, after a period of time, or even straight out, who want to get involved in policy, in research, in teaching, education. Otherwise, we don't have a future profession. If everybody goes into the same job and remains in that same job in the same area all the time, then the profession dies at that point. Because who trains the next generation, or who finds the next research to underpin nursing decision making, or who is there at the table, as Charlotte said, in terms of the policy, to make sure that the nursing voice is there in the policy directives. We do need this diversity, and it actually is really key that we don't just get sucked into feeding one machine.
Just to build on the points that Jessica and Laura have made there, if we want a health outcome, or health outcomes in the UK to be as best as they possibly can, we need health in all policies, whether it's the Department of Health or the Department of Education or the Department of the Economy. And to have people with experience of working, particularly outside of hospitals actually, and in communities, working with communities and supporting communities to make decisions about their own health, then we need a very broad range of expertise. And I would certainly not support the idea that as a new nurse, you have to serve your stripes, Jessica, in wards. Actually, the future of nursing for me is much more about public and population health. It's outside of hospital walls. It's caring for people in their own homes, when we know that care at home is the best and should be the first place of care. And it's about really influencing and shaping policy right across interdepartmental groups right across the UK. And if we narrow ourselves into this idea that nursing is about sick people in hospitals, it actually really undersells the value and the worth that nursing and midwives bring to the table.
Michael, if I could come to you, we've heard about the need to make sure the voice of nursing and midwifery is heard throughout an organisation, indeed throughout the system. I was wondering if you could speak a bit about how to empower nurses to make sure that that voice is heard at all levels.
So I think that what my colleagues have said have given an indication that we need to do this at two levels. There's the kind of structural level of making sure that nurses and midwives' voices are heard in national bodies, on executive boards, at every level of the system, particularly those most influential levels. But we also need to make sure that the voices of nurses and midwives are heard in their day-to-day work, and that's about making sure that there are opportunities for that in teams. So we see places like Nottinghamshire University Hospitals, Gloucestershire Hospitals, where they have nursing councils. There are 87 in the Nottingham case, where people have protected time to meet to discuss key issues. We see great examples in primary care, the Jubilee practice in Leicester, where they have 2 team meetings a week, so everyone's voice is heard, where there's a partners meeting and everyone is invited to, so everyone's voice is heard. And that was a counterintuitive way of dealing with work overload. And it was hugely successful. I think in Northern Ireland, the neighbourhood district nursing framework is an outstanding example of ensuring that district nurses, community nurses are shaping the services in their area, and where they're completely involved in strategic and local decision making. And in the care sector, Erskine Care Homes has been doing great work about giving voice to people's needs for growth and development. I think we also have to have a shared vision of how we are going to help this, probably the largest, highly skilled, highly motivated workforce of anywhere in industry, how we're going to transform their working conditions so that they thrive and grow and are able to deliver the care they wish to. And that's about having a shared vision and having a collective voice from the whole of nursing and midwifery and all concerned stakeholders, and that we persist and we persist and we persist in bringing about these changes, underpinned by compassionate leadership at every level. Thank you.
And again, be interested, Wendy, from your perspective, but also from the perspective of social care, about what some of those changes that are most needed to try and improve people's working conditions.
I think certainly from a social care perspective, it has to fit into everything that's already been said. And when you look at the future nurse, you look at the future roles. Social care is absolutely slap bang in the centre of that. I don't think we can see nursing without social care nursing. I think that what is needed is that infrastructure support and investment, and social care being seen as a leader rather than a follower. I think that we know there are workforce pressures in terms of the numbers of nurses we have. There's lots have happened in the last few months about recruiting additional student nurses. We have this 50k target. The 50k target is for NHS, absolutely and completely. So are we looking at how we're recruiting to social care? Are we looking at that wider public health agenda? And I think those sorts of things will give wider opportunities, and that will improve people's individual work-life balance and the challenges that they can take on. I'd just add something, from earlier, the discussion around preceptorship and supporting nurses into the profession. Maybe we could borrow something from the social work model, where they have an assessed, supported, funded year in employment. We don't have that consistent approach to nursing, and maybe that's something that we could actually look at across sectors as well, and actually welcoming the student into the nursing family. They are part of the nursing family right at the get-go. It's not the student, it's our student, and I think that's really important as well.
Thank you. I'm going to pick up, perhaps to close this section, one of the most popular questions on Slido, and it's also a slightly perhaps controversial one. It's how we bridge the disconnect between senior managers, senior leaders, and frontline staff, particularly now that, as we are doing now, many people are engaging virtually in the digital world rather than face to face. I'm going to come to Charlotte first of all, if you don't mind.
Thanks. So COVID has effectively changed how we work, and many of us are not now connecting in the same way as we were previously within teams, and that poses challenges. I mean, it poses challenges even in terms of managing through the COVID scenario, where frontline staff are dealing with very, very high levels of stress, emotion, distraught families, death, etc. And the normal way in which we respond to that is to have a group hug, a bit of a debrief, a cup of tea together. All of the things that we can't do now. We simply cannot do those things during COVID, and it's extremely difficult for staff. So I think supporting their mental health and well-being is a key priority. I know as CNOs we've talked about that across the 4 countries and what we can do to further support staff. It is about alternative ways of communication and making sure that those lines of communication are kept open and that people are getting the right information in a timely way. One of the things that I've done is to start a digital platform for all nurses and midwives in Northern Ireland through the NIPEC, or Northern Ireland Practice Education Council website. And it's one of their most popular websites because it does provide up-to-date information for nurses and midwives on a whole range of issues. I think Michael mentioned it earlier, the use of digital technology will forever change how we've used it during COVID, will forever change how we work in health and social care. And we've had to get much more comfortable with using that. And that is the way forward. It has to be supplemented, I think, with face-to-face conversations, but we do have to accept that this is a new way of working and make sure that we check in regularly, that there are regular team briefs. I'm a very big fan of safety huddles. First thing in the day, last thing in the evening, a check-in just before everybody goes, giving everybody the opportunity to raise any issues or concerns, or indeed to say, well done today. Sometimes, staff just need to hear that they're doing a really good job under very difficult circumstances. And those things can make a very big difference. For me, it's about a focus on communication and finding alternative ways to do that.
Well, local examples. So within the system that I'm within, we've buddied up, senior leaders with either newly qualified nurses or nursing students. So whilst that's not, the day-to-day team and how they're connected, that is a way of establishing a relationship with someone who you think is far from your reach, and as a student, I've personally benefited from it. So I did, or I'm doing, reverse mentoring with the chief nurse of my trust, and it's beneficial both ways. I could go on about it for ages, but I won't. But then if you think about your immediate teams as well, it's about flattening those hierarchies a bit, and making people feel like they do have a voice and they will be listened to. I think in a lot of teams that I've come across that are unhappy, shall we say, it's because there has been this hierarchy in place, and people don't feel like they're being heard, or that their opinion even matters, and they're just there to do their job and go home again. But for the teams that I've worked in as a student and now as a registrant, there hasn't been that hierarchy in place. Obviously, different people have different roles, but there's regular check-ins, as Charlotte was saying, and if they're and it's not just about the things that aren't going so well, or the things you want to have a little whinge about. It's about being able to shout about the successes of the team and other team members, and having that identity as a team yourselves, with a real mix of people in it, who in different roles, different professions. I think that really helps.
Great, thank you very much. And it's amazing, but we are beginning to run out of time now. So what I was going to do was just come around to the panel one last time for any closing reflections that they may have on priorities for action, to try and take this agenda forward, or indeed how we make sure that this agenda and the focus on it is sustained. Can I come first, please, to Laura?
I think it's really important that we don't lose sight of the fact that it's important that nurses and midwives, that we're actually there at the table to help set some of the strategies and some of the direction. It would be a real shame if this report, which is so valuable in highlighting the challenges that we faced, ends up just being filed on a shelf. But we need to make sure that we are there and we're holding our hands up to actually challenge why we're not there at the beginning of decision making, and not just there at the end to action the decisions that have already been taken. It's up to us really to some extent. And I know Charlotte and the other chief nurses of the 4 countries are doing what they can to make sure that our voices are heard. But we need to do that everywhere, from the first level of qualification right through education and social care and the other areas in which we work.
I'd echo what Laura said. It is about the voice of nursing, and I think for me, the voice of social care nursing. We are getting a chief nurse for social care the first time in certainly in my memory, and that may well put a different emphasis on nursing, and I think that's important. I think the framework that has come out of this report is really key, and all organisations should look to how they can implement that and put that at the heart of how they're managing their staff and working with staff to get their voice heard within their own organisation as well. Thank you.
I think for me, I am very passionate about the contribution that nurses and midwives make to the outcomes of the populations that we serve. And I believe that we have so much more to give, and we should try to make sure that every nurse and midwife works to the top end of their licence, and they have a real valuable contribution to make in the health outcomes to the population. And I think the report's been very aptly named compassion. And that's been magnified for me tenfold during this COVID-19 pandemic, where the very significant role that nurses and midwives have played right through this pandemic has been really profiled in the public eye. And I think it's incumbent on all of us as leaders to make sure that out of this pandemic, we have the opportunity to ensure that nursing and midwifery grows as professions and maximises the opportunity for the contribution that they make.
Just closing comments from me is really just listen to and value your students and all your staff, other members of your team. And it's really important to not make decisions about people without them being at the table. I guess we're saying that overall as nursing and midwifery, but when it comes to decisions about students, make sure they have that voice and it's not just a token one to tick a box. And it's just so important to grow your own. Don't eat your young, as I know is a phrase that's been associated with nursing in particular, and just to nurture nurture your nurses?
I think the number one priority for leaders at every level of our health and social care system must be to support our staff in health and social care now in the middle of this crisis and for the long-term future. And that's about having, particularly in relation to nursing and midwifery, having a vision of the kind of work life we want to help nurture for nurses and midwives, which is characterized by joy at work rather than by chronic stress. And it's really important that we achieve that most effectively by focusing on meeting those core needs that we talk about in the report. And it's important, I think, that leaders and all involved in nursing and midwifery persist in seeking to bring about that vision over long-term time. They have the courage to persist in seeking to enact that vision. That's the courage of compassion.
So thank you very much to all of our panel for their contribution today, and thank you also to the people that are watching. Do remember that you can share a link to this session with a colleague and they then watch on demand as well. And when this finishes, you'll be redirected to a resources page. There's also a feedback button at the bottom of the screen. I really appreciate any feedback you've got to give us, and a survey will come and will follow. I can say certainly as well, for the King's Fund, this is going to stay an issue of great importance to us. We're really grateful to the sponsor, the RCN Foundation, for all that they've done and made this possible for us. But I can commit our organisation again to try and make sure that this conversation and this issue remains in the spotlight. Thank you very much, everybody.